ADHD is most often diagnosed in children, but in recent years, a growing number of women in particular have been getting diagnosed as adults. It's a life-changing diagnosis that comes at a time when there's a new understanding of how ADHD appears differently in girls and women. Our Diane Macedo looked into this trend of women receiving this later in life news and opens up about her own recent diagnosis as part of a new ABC News Live series, Inside ADHD.
I believed the lies that I was lazy, dumb, unmotivated.
For decades, Jessica Covington said she struggled with things like organization, staying on task, remembering details. The result, she thought, of a moral failure.
I always felt a sense of not being good enough.
But that all changed in 2014, when Jessica says she got a diagnosis that changed her life.
For me, it explained so much that it was a huge relief.
Jessica's part of a growing trend of women being diagnosed with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a condition that originates in childhood with often lifelong symptoms.
You say brains are different for people with ADHD. So what do those differences cause in everyday life?
Persistent struggles with things like time management, things like planning, things like organization, focusing, attention, hyperactivity.
ADHD diagnoses among women have been on the rise for decades, but a recent study shows a dramatic spike from 2020 to 2022, with diagnoses among women 23 to 49 years old nearly doubling. Experts say the rise is due in part to a shift in understanding how ADHD affects girls and women.
So there's this inherent bias within our culture. Boys are the ones that have ADHD. It looks like a busybody boy who's rambunctious. But studies show that girls present with inattention. They may not be jumping up and down, but they'll be twirling their hair, clicking the pencil, shaking their legs, and they get overlooked. And it's really, really devastating because they don't get the supports.
Now, as grown women, many are unexpectedly getting that diagnosis later in life, often after learning about their children's ADHD.
So what was it for you as you were trying to find answers for your son that then prompted you to get evaluated?
It was a book by Dr. Edward Hallowell called Super Parenting for ADD. I was reading it from the perspective of a parent, but also from the perspective of that misunderstood kid.
So Jessica says she asked her therapist if she might have ADHD and got a surprising answer.
She kind of looked at me and said, it's interesting that you got to be this age and didn't know.
So she knew already.
She kind of had it pegged since we met.
Many more women are being tipped off by social media.
When I started seeing videos about women particularly were struggling to keep their houses clean or organized or tidy, or they start one task and then they do another.
Parenting influencer Libby Ward says it was those types of videos that made her realize she might have ADHD and eventually get diagnosed by a healthcare provider.
It was kind of a relief to consider that there might be a reason why I struggled with so many different things. But it was also very confusing because I had been shaming myself for so long for all the ways that I struggled to adult, essentially.
The same thing happened to me. As a former honors student, best-selling author, and successful news anchor, ADHD wasn't even on my radar.
I didn't realize that this was actually an ADHD thing until recently.
Until I started seeing more and more videos about it on Instagram and TikTok, including Libby's.
One of the ways that having ADHD affects you is that you forget how it affects you.
At first, I thought everyone's brains work that way, but I finally booked a formal evaluation, and sure enough, I was diagnosed with ADHD. The experience was eye-opening.
Is there anything in particular from, relationships, financial stuff, hygiene stuff, living arrangements that feels particularly tricky?
This might sound silly, but packing is something that's really hard for me.
I do not cry easily, but just 4 minutes into the intake, while talking about packing of all things, I was suddenly in tears.
I just find, sorry, I'm getting a little emotional, but I think all my coping mechanisms worked really well for me until I became a mom. And now I have 2 kids and I love them dearly. And I really value my role, despite, I think most people associate me with my career. I really value being a wife and being a mother, and I take those roles really seriously. And I just find it really hard sometimes to manage all of that and the expectations that I put on myself when I feel like I have to battle my brain in doing it all the time.
As I'm talking, I have a small example of that battle right on my own feet.
I put things down and I have no recollection of where I put them. I have sneakers on right now because I forgot my shoes, even though I had them in my hand as I was about to walk out of my office door. That happens to me all the time.
But people with ADHD can also be extremely bright and often excel in areas like creativity, problem solving, and an ability to laser focus in certain situations.
A lot of people can benefit from this if they're in creative fields. They get ideas quicker. Their minds are busier, but it's full of more ideas at once.
Hi, I'm Diane Macedo. We have breaking news. We have breaking news. Breaking news.
So things like breaking news coverage, which most people find incredibly difficult, feels like second nature to me. But managing emails and expenses is another story. And having kids often exacerbates those executive function issues.
How did motherhood impact all of that?
It multiplied at times 10. Not only was I facing challenges with executive function in my own life and my own career, now I had to be the executive function for someone else. I couldn't remember from moment to moment, had the baby eaten? Had I, given the medicine? What time?
Libby even wrote a blog, 10 Ways I Thought I Sucked at Motherhood when it really was the ADHD.
I would write lists and not be able to find the list, or I would make a system for how we would organize the shoes and I would forget the system the next week. The shame really came from not understanding that it was a part of how my brain functioned and not just a personality flaw.
Then many of us become perfectionist overachievers, desperately trying to prove we are good mothers, good adults, good people.
What I see when these girls grow up is that they spend so much energy trying to compensate for the fact that it takes them longer to plan, it takes them longer to execute, that they become depressed and they become anxious.
I would make really detailed lists and schedules. That feeling of needing to be over-prepared for things that may or may not ever come to pass.
I'm listening to you thinking, check, check.
Now, 10 years later, Jessica has not only learned how to manage her ADHD symptoms,
Intrinsic motivation is the name of the game.
she even coaches others with ADHD, while Libby's writing her first book and sharing about ADHD and parenting with her nearly 2 million social media followers.
I have been stopped on the street countless times by women who have said, I just got my diagnosis and I never would have gone to my doctor if you hadn't shared your story.
I'm one of them. Like, here we are, full circle, honestly.
It gives me goosebumps.
Creating awareness is so important because there's just so much power in knowing what ADHD is and how it's impacting you, because then you can actually set up your life to be successful living with ADHD.
So helpful to know more about it. Our thanks to Diane for those stories and sharing her own. And Diane's journey with ADHD is just beginning. So be sure to check out the new series Inside ADHD on ABC News Live, which will feature expert interviews and a first-hand look at Diane's challenges and triumphs navigating her own ADHD.